let me get on to introducing our guest this evening. I'm delighted to welcome a good friend and comrade in arms, Douglas Carswell. Many of you will know him as a true political trailblazer. Initially a Conservative MP, he made history by switching to UKIP, winning their first ever seat, both in a by-election and then at the general election, before later serving as an independent. He has since swapped the Clacton coast for the American South, where he's now making waves as the president of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. And we'll make sure there's a link to the Mississippi Center for Public Policy in the chat. Follow their good work. Very, very interesting, especially it being headed up by an Englishman. Despite the distance between London and Mississippi, he remains a sharp and essential voice in British politics, regularly dropping truth bombs in the Daily Telegraph and elsewhere. Douglas, welcome. Great to have you with us. How is the Magnolia State, have I got that right, of Mississippi?
Hello, Mark. It's wonderful to join you and lovely to hear from you and lovely to talk in front of so many fellow Brits. It's lovely over here in the Magnolia State. Yes, it is called the Magnolia State. Mississippi, the poorest state in America, which has now overtaken the UK in per capita GDP terms. It's a state that's doing rather well. And yeah, there are lots of things I think Brits could learn from Mississippi. So lovely to talk to you about some of those tonight.
Great. Well, let's start with the wider American picture, Douglas. You and I think there's probably only barely a cigarette paper between us in terms of our broad political philosophy. We're both Brexiteers, probably philosophically would be described as conservative classical liberals, I guess, very staunchly free market, extremely skeptical about the powers of the state and the prevailing establishment. With that, looking at it through that sort of lens, if you accept that sort of lens is the way that you and I look at the world, what do we make of the Trump administration? Trump 2.0, I mean, we could go through the history books about his first term in office, but what do we make of Trump? I don't necessarily mean in terms of his style, although we might touch on that a bit. I mean, ideologically, how do we pigeonhole him? Is this guy a free marketeer or a statist? Is he a non-interventionist? Is he a neocon interventionist? Give us the pen picture, because just before we went on air, you said that you thought the way he's perceived in Britain might not be wholly accurate.
I don't think it's helpful for people analysing Trump and analysing American politics to try to assess him through the prism of ideology and philosophy. Why? Because he doesn't have one. He doesn't have an ideology or a philosophy. He's basically a New York property developer who sees the world, as you might expect from a property developer, generally in zero-sum terms. In other words, for him to gain, someone else loses. For America to gain, someone else loses. You could spend a great deal of time lamenting the fact that he may not agree with you and me and people like us on things like free trade. He may, as you alluded to, have a style that is rather brash. But I think a lot of this just misses the point. On a number of things where Western governments have for 30 or 40 years been wholly ineffective, he has proved to be, for the most part, highly effective. I'll give you an example. Immigration. Throughout my life, I've been told that mass immigration was something one just had to get used to. It was inevitable. It was rather like the British rain. It was something that was just going to happen, and there was no point in complaining about it. He's proved that wrong. He's secured the southern border, stopped illegal immigration, and deported millions of people in just over a year, and is on course to deport something like 5 to 7 million illegal immigrants over the course of his second term. So, the Middle East, I'm not going to talk about Iran, but everything apart from Iran. For years, we've been told that, certain things were baked into our worldview. He then came along and achieved the Abraham Accords. Again and again and again, he does things that we were told couldn't be done. So I would just caution people who, like me, dislike very much his rhetoric over Greenland, find the way he responded to Denmark, a staunch American ally, deeply regrettable. Put that aside. Put aside the virtue signaling prejudices of the British commentariat. Look at some of the big picture things he's addressing. He's controlling immigration. He's reversing mass illegal immigration. He's reining back the size of the federal government and the growth of federal government. And he's doing things that we were told couldn't be done. So I don't judge him from a ideological prism, but I think there are things he's doing that are actually essential correctives after 30 or 40 years of, frankly, delusional Western government.
As you know, Douglas, I'm a big football supporter, and they say the best football players are the ones who surprise the opposition by what they do next because they themselves don't know what they're going to do next. Is this politically true of Trump? Or is there some plan which is not easily discernible to the commentariat or indeed folk like you and I in think tanks and campaign groups? Or is there some sort of master plan here for the 4 years of Trump 2.0?
It would be a big mistake to dismiss Trump as shambolic and chaotic. Perhaps in Trump 1, he underestimated the extent to which he would receive resistance from the administrative state. He underestimated the need to have a good team around him, and he ended up having to basically bring in family members who he could trust, and he wasn't wholly successful. Trump 2 is a completely different kettle of fish. There clearly has been a very carefully choreographed plan. People like Stephen Miller. When Trump came in the second term, he signed a series of executive orders. You remember the sign of him signing at his desk, those impromptu press conferences. That had been very carefully choreographed, very carefully thought through. Venezuela, I think, again, that shows deep planning and thoughtfulness. So, yes, there is sometimes perhaps a slight impulsiveness in the way he communicates. We see this on his postings on social media, but don't make the mistake of thinking that those around him haven't choreographed several steps ahead of their critics. Just because the Trump administration doesn't wine and dine journalists to get them to write favorable puff pieces in newspapers, don't assume that Trump's team doesn't know what it's doing. It often does. And I'm often quite surprised at how, on the rare occasions when I watch, for example, BBC World, you get Washington-based journalists opining about Trump who frankly know remarkably little about it. Don't mistake the fact that the media isn't aware of what Trump is doing. Don't mistake that for the fact that Trump doesn't know what Trump is doing. I think actually Trump 2 has been in many ways remarkably well choreographed and orchestrated.
This is fascinating. We might come back to this when we move on to talking about British domestic politics. But you mentioned Stephen Miller and the executive orders. I mean, this was something beyond choreography, wasn't it? This was sort of years of planning, that in the eventuality that Trump was successful. I mean, my friend David Starkey was telling me that there was one of these executive orders, I don't know which, and I think it was a complicated one, that took a total of 18 months to draft, such that it was perfect. So that this was a matter of pre-planning and prioritization, as much as it's a matter of kind of choreography and vision.
Correct. And I don't want to jump ahead of ourselves, but it's precisely for this reason. Yeah, I was only very, very, very peripherally involved in Project 2025 or whatever it's called, Project 2025, which received quite a lot of negative publicity. But actually, if you look at what Trump is doing, it bears remarkable, uncanny parallels with a lot of that thinking. Precisely because of my observations of that I think if you want to turn Britain around, if you want to rein in the administrative state, deal with the leftist activist judges, control our borders, do all sorts of things that Trump is doing, you need to similarly choreograph several steps ahead. You need a plan, not just a plan. You need the actual bills and the British equivalent of executive orders in council, drafted long before the election. So I think there's a really important lesson. We need British versions of Stephen Miller if we're going to rescue the United Kingdom the way that I think Trump, for all his faults, is turning America around.
Cheryl Hennell, Cheryl's good to see you. She says, I see PDP, President Donald Trump, took me a while to work out the acronym, as a great disruptor. He throws in a grenade, knows exactly what he's doing, but watch
Yep.
the bystanders jump. They don't like the change he brings. It's not in their playbook. They really do not know how to respond. Is that how we should see Trump, as a disruptor against a failed establishment?
Yes, very much so. I mean, maybe this is a way of thinking about it. Maybe ever since the mid 1990s, Western governments have been run by essentially deluded fantasists who had an ideology, a fantasy ideology that the world was moving towards Western style liberal democracy, a fantasy belief that they should be promoting idealism around the world, and who didn't really appreciate or nurture the true secret of Western success and the origins of Western ascendancy. And what they essentially did, the Blairites in Britain and the Obamaites, for want of a better word, in America, was neglect Western exceptionalism. And perhaps what we see in Trump is someone who is prepared to defend Western cultural precedents in the West, who is prepared to say and do things. And it's very disruptive, but it's not. It's an essential corrective to 30 or 40 years of Davos man delusion. And so I think there's plenty wrong with Trump. I'm not in favor of tariffs. I think that's a mistake. I think his treatment of Denmark and others has been appalling. There are things that he's done, I think, that are simply wrong. But overall, I think he's doing things that if a British government were to do would be not only popular, but absolutely, I think, are probably essential if Britain is to survive as a viable state. I spent much of my adult life campaigning to restore British sovereignty. And I now realize I made a profound and elemental mistake. I always believed that sovereignty was based on an idea, a principle. Actually, I've come to realize that ideology is misplaced. We need to practice politics and foreign policy based on realism. Sovereignty ultimately is an expression of power. And if you are so dysfunctional as a country, it doesn't matter what referendums you win and what bits of paper you have and what treaties you sign with your neighbors, you cease to have sovereignty. So I think if you are someone who believes in nation states, who believes in British sovereignty, who wants Britain to succeed, you should pay attention to the fact that America now has leadership that is no longer peddling the post-Cold War fantasies and is actually doing things that actually I think will really matter to the viability of Western states if they want to remain Western and states.
Now, let's talk a little about your new home, Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
Alistair Stewart asks, I've really appreciated listening to Douglas's podcast, Coming to America. He says, but there haven't been new episodes since October. I hope new episodes are coming soon, as I really enjoyed hearing about the success of proper liberal policies in Mississippi and beyond, especially on school choice. I mean, I guess at some point you've got to stop coming to America and you've got to start being in America, right? But what tell us a little about the comparators. I mean, I'm always interested in comparators whilst being wary that you can't just hit Control-C, Control-V and map what policies from one jurisdiction directly onto another. But that doesn't mean we can't learn from them. Tell us a little about this Mississippi overtaking the UK GDP, whether this is just we're doing things badly or you're doing things particularly well, or is it a bit of both? What's the success story of your state?
Crash course in Mississippi politics over the past 5 years, a series of really big strategic reforms. 2021, we introduced labour market deregulation. 2022, we introduced flat tax reform. We've kept energy costs remarkably low so that electricity is about a third the price it is in the UK. 2024, we introduced school funding reform so that every child in the state system in Mississippi has a dedicated personalised budget. Now we're working to ensure that they can take that budget to any school of their choice. And then last year, 2025, we implemented legislation that will eliminate the income tax in the state completely. Now, overall, that is a very potent free market policy mix. And you see this in the data. In the past 5 years, since we started to implement this reform, Mississippi has had more economic growth in the past 5 years than over the previous 15. imagine if Britain could say that. Imagine if there had been more economic growth in Britain over the past 5 years than the preceding 15. Britain's almost the exact inverse of that. There hasn't been any significant per capita growth in Britain in 20 years. Why? Because, well, Mississippi has embraced free market ideas and implemented free market reform. And having once been a laggard, is now a leader when it comes to free market reform in America. Well, Mississippi has done all of that. Britain has moved in the opposite direction. Britain has an incredibly regimented labor market. You've got the highest tax burden in 50 years. Yes, you left the European Union, but you've still got the European disease, thanks to Boris Johnson and others. There's been a fundamental failure in Britain to implement the sorts of reforms that are allowing America to boom. Now, there'll be some of your viewers who will say, but it's not fair to compare Britain to Mississippi. Yeah, there are differences. Britain has some 60 million people. Mississippi only has 3 million people. But, don't say that it's unfair that I'm comparing Mississippi energy costs with British energy costs. What's all that stuff doing under the ground in the shale deposits of Lancashire? What's all that stuff doing in the North Sea? You've got access to the same energy. It's the same laws of physics. The reason why you're doing bad economically is because you've had an insane energy policy that has priced the UK economy out of being globally competitive. And you've used basically the same economic model for 30 years. Ever since Ken Clarke started this as Chancellor, you've used fiscal and monetary stimulus to induce growth. Now, it did induce growth. Running a budget surplus, which is what a budget deficit, which is what you've done since 2021, and having low interest rates and hosing cheap credit at the economy has created growth. But it's ultimately unsustainable growth. You should have changed the economic model in Britain in 2007, 2008, when you got the financial crisis. Instead, the Blairite regimes that have run the country since have doubled down on this monetary stimulus model. And you're now getting to a stage where the bond market is frankly going to call time on this. And there will come a time, I think, fairly soon, when the British government is simply forced dramatically to either cut spending or print money and create runaway inflation. This monetary stimulus economic model that you've had in Britain has been catastrophic. And, I think Britain fundamentally needs to rethink pretty much economic policy since November 1990.
Fascinating. Now, we're just putting a survey up, asking people what they think about President Trump. Very open-ended question. Are you very positive all the way through to very negative? We'll get the results of that in the next 5 or 10 minutes. Let's look backwards a bit before we move to Britain's contemporary problems, Douglas. You were, well, not just at the time of the referendum, for many years leading up to it, a public and an intellectual force in favour of Brexit. We're just 3 months or so away from the 10th anniversary of the referendum, although I appreciate there was an agonising interregnum between the referendum and Parliament actually executing the will of the British people. But and I was on the same side. I did nothing like as much as you, but from my ivory tower at the IEA, I was personally in favour of Brexit as well and did a little bit to support it. Was it worth the candle? I mean, the amount of political energy, time, parliamentary time, effort that was put into this titanic battle, which we were all told was going to be sort of the most meaningful vote of our lifetimes, biggest constitutional change since God knows when, the English Civil War, I think some people were claiming, or at least since we joined the EU. And yet it doesn't appear to have amounted to a whole hill of beans. I mean, this was just the dog that never barked, wasn't it? I mean, it sort of seems to me that whether we stayed or whether we left, virtually no impact one way or another. We haven't obviously fallen behind the EU. We haven't obviously advanced ahead of the EU. Was it worth the candle?
I think it's fair to say Britain's in a pretty sorry state. The economy hasn't grown per capita. There's some evidence that actually the country's going backwards. The one thing that would have made it even worse would be if we were still in the European Union. At least by virtue of being outside, you begin to diverge from a high tax, high regulation model. But it's true. The country has simply failed to take full advantage of the opportunities of Brexit. In fact, in many instances, the autonomy that we got outside the European Union didn't lead us to deregulate. Actually, you had a number of ministers who brought in even more gold plating. Michael Gove, in particular, was guilty of this as a post-Brexit minister. When we advocated for Britain leaving the European Union, we advocated for deregulation. It's very regrettable, for example, that we haven't deregulated the digital economy. We essentially still comply with GDPR regulations in Britain. We essentially still abide by the EU Clinical Trials Directive. There's not really been a conscientious effort to get rid of a lot of the EU-era regulations. I think it's fair to say that having achieved self-government, Britain has still not learned how to govern itself well. And if I may say in my defense, I sort of saw this coming. One of the reasons I stood down in 2017 was because I thought that whoever was in government was going to sooner or later discover that the machinery of the state, the ability of us to practice effective statecraft, had whittled away. And when we were in the EU, the extent to which we had our statecraft had atrophied had been hidden. Once we left the European Union, I thought it would come as a rather rude awakening to discover just how badly run the country was. We have a civil service that saw its role largely as transposing EU decisions into UK law. They had forgotten the ability to actually make good judgments and implement good policy themselves. So I set up an initiative called the Good Governance Project and came up with a blueprint for doing many of the things that Dominic Cummings, since leaving office, has advocated for. The frustrating thing is, having come up with a blueprint for Whitehall reform, neither Dominic nor Boris showed the slightest bit of interest in actually implementing it when they were in a position to do so. None of the rather tedious but essential reforms like rewriting the Civil Service Management Code, which we had done and proposed and come up with a model for, they weren't really willing to do any of that. I think at some point we will learn the art of self-government, but it will require a new type of administration, not just a change of government, but a change in the way that Britain is governed. So I don't think one can yet judge the effect of Brexit based on what's happened over the past 10 years. We've essentially had continuity Blairism for the past decade. What we need is not just to leave the European Union. We need a British rather than a Davos government running the country and willing to make the radical internal changes. We've got home rule. We haven't yet figured out how to rule at home.
Really interesting. Well, Anne-Marie Cooper asks, and we'll put a link in the chat. I think it was about a year ago, if I recall, Douglas, you wrote a very substantial piece for the Daily Telegraph, but which might answer Anne-Marie's question. Good to see you, Anne-Marie. She asks the very, well, short, I was going to say, not straightforward necessarily short question. How can our sovereignty, democracy and government accountability be restored? What is the recipe for this? If just unplugging the European Union app wasn't enough, and Jacob Rees-Mogg's very fond of saying this, that the liberation was we unplugged lots of things from the plug sockets in the wall, but we haven't rewired anything yet. So we've just got all of this wiring lying around. We need nothing happening. What is the remedy? We need a revolution, a restorationist revolution. Not a revolution that tries to create utopia, but a revolution that tries to recreate good government. I was very frustrated by the fact that, looking back across the Atlantic from my perch here in Mississippi, no one in Britain seemed to be doing what Stephen Miller had done for Donald Trump. No one seemed to have come up with a detailed proposal to allow an incoming administration to fundamentally change things. We've essentially had a system where the people we elect change,
the color of the party in government changes, but we're governed by the same people. We have a Downing Street that is essentially ineffective. No one can get anything done. Judges and civil servants basically prevent ministers from doing anything. And it's almost like the uniparty has been in charge, essentially because we're governed by the permanent officials and the judiciary. So we need a restoration revolution that comes into office with a very clear idea of statecraft, a very clear idea of what powers can and must be wielded to achieve particular outcomes. Step number one, an incoming administration needs to re-establish control and mastery of the civil service. This will require insisting that the monarch sign a number of orders in council to allow the prime minister, whether it's Farage or a conservative prime minister, to essentially remove a lot of the senior civil servants and to reorganize and rewire Whitehall. We need a department of the prime minister so that instead of having the great cuckoo in the nest, the cabinet office in charge, we have a prime minister and a prime minister's department able to assert mastery over the machinery. Learning lessons from Australia and the Republic of Ireland, we need to ensure that there is effective executive control over who's spending what in Whitehall and making sure that you get outcomes and project delivery. We've seen a recent series of horrendous examples of defence procurement inadequacy exposed. We spend vast amounts, billions of pounds every year on defence, and yet we're unable to muster so much as a bathtub to sail to the Middle East. This is because we don't have effective control over how money is spent, effective project management. So we need a department of the Prime Minister that can assert its mastery over Whitehall. We then also need to assert control.
Can I just ask on that? I know it's a slightly aesthetic point. Would you move the Prime Minister out of number 10? Just make that the private residence rather than a working office?
It's incredibly unhelpful to get drawn into that. One of the reasons why Dominic, I think, failed in his role and failed in his opportunity is because he became obsessed about ideas about open plan offices. I mean, frankly, the building is irrelevant. Yeah. You need a department of the Prime Minister. Where you locate it matters neither here nor there. But a department of the Prime Minister needs oversight over the machinery of government. And I detail in Milestones, an essay I wrote, how you do that. I actually drafted some of the orders in council for the King to sign. You also need emergency legislation to rein in judicial review. You will find that even if Nigel Farage, for example, won a parliamentary majority of 100 and created a new department for deportation, you wouldn't be able to remove a single illegal migrant from the country without tackling the judges. And I don't mean just leaving the ECHR, European Convention on Human Rights. You need to remove from office many of the leftist activists who are masquerading as judges. So you need a Judicial Tenure Act. You need to ensure that anyone who's been appointed over the past decade or so under the Judicial Appointments Commission is up for reassessment, whether they should remain in their role. You need to have that fight with the judiciary. If you don't do it, you will go the way of every administration over the past 30 years and be thwarted by the courts. So, week one, establish mastery of control over the civil service, rein in the leftist activists in the judiciary. And then there are things you need to start to do to remove from the country the millions of people who've come into the country, not to contribute economically, but essentially to live off the British welfare system. Yeah. And I think it can be done, and I think you need to do it. I think if you don't do it, you will essentially cease to be a country within a short period of time. If a centre-right government is elected to do these things and fails, then I think you open up the door to Tommy Robinson and others. So I really do think it's last chance saloon for those of us on the right to come up with a working plan to put the country back on its feet. You also need to rein in public spending. The country is hurtling towards bankruptcy. And I come up with a way of doing that. And when you can afford to, you need things like tax cuts. But none of this can be done. None of these reforms can be done unless you have an administration that has a theory of power and a theory of statecraft. How is it that we should wield power using new institutions and new methods to achieve the outcomes that the electorate wants us to achieve?
This is really interesting. Just let me give you the feedback on those who've joined us live on the Zoom call on their opinion of President Trump. 27% very positive opinion of the president. 53% a mostly positive opinion of the president. So that's 80% in total in the positive column. Neutral or don't know, 8%, mostly negative, 10%, very negative, 2%. But I suppose that what I should ask you, Douglas, is do you think, therefore, this is rather unlike what Trump's doing? He hasn't, as far as I'm aware, fundamentally reset the constitutional arrangements of the United States. He hasn't sort of come in and said, I'm going to completely change the relationship. I want to change the relationships in Congress and the White House, or I have a completely different view on states' rights. I mean, I know he's had the opportunity just out of serendipity to make an unusually high number of Supreme Court appointments, but that's just the way the cookie crumbles. You're suggesting that the next sane UK administration needs to do the constitutional reset first, right?
Yeah.
Which seems to me a lot bigger than working out what executive order you sign in order to change flood defenses in one part of the country.
Yeah, I mean, the American system is, America is reforming itself and addressing its problems from a position rather analogous with Britain in its Victorian heyday. It has a lot more leeway to get things right. America's constitutional model is essentially in good shape. I would argue that since the New Deal, the federal government's become overbearing. Trump has appointed these judges who are now adjudicating in a way that is essentially returning power back to the states, and that's a very good thing too. Britain has a rather different situation. We've had basically 100 years of decline with a brief 10-year interlude under Thatcher against that decline. And we've also had a corruption of our constitution. Until the 1930s, backbench MPs could amend budgets. Until the 1990s, Parliament effectively set those budgets. Today, it's now the civil service in the Treasury using control totals. The people that we elected used to have some say over the laws that we abide by. Now you've got a situation in which the administrative state in Britain makes guidelines that the courts then interpret as having the force of law. So the British Constitution has been essentially corrupted. Now, some people would say, 30, 40 years ago, we talked about elective dictatorship. Has there been an over-concentration of power? I used to think that was the case, but I've changed my mind. Actually, Britain's problem is not that power is too concentrated. If power was too concentrated, the people in Downing Street could get stuff done. They can't. They can't so much as build a runway or a road or a reservoir in Britain. They can't deport a single migrant because for all the appearance of power being centralized, actually the system is now set up so that any minister trying to get anything done essentially has to have the permission of the career civil servants and the judiciary. You have an army of lawyers in Whitehall who see their job not to offer ministers advice of how to get things done, but to offer excuses as to why the status quo must be perpetuated. Now, that is going to require change. Japan in the late 19th century underwent something called the Meiji Restoration. It was a revolution. It broke the suffocating hold of the Tokugawa clan. We need to break the suffocating hold of the Mandarin clan, and we need to treat them as an enemy of the country. We need to treat them as fundamentally hostile to the well-being of Britain. And until we break the hold of the Mandarinate and the leftist judiciary, we're never going to recover. Elections will be like they were in Italy for many years, simply a demonstration of popular dissatisfaction. Voters in Italy would vote for ever more outlandish, cartoonish character figures, and nothing would ever change. It's a great irony that since voting to leave the European Union, we've basically Italianized British politics. We need a British Meiji Restoration to end this nonsense.
Now, Dilly Bradley asks an interesting question here. In fact, there are a couple to take on how to approach this. project, thinking about, spending this year and next year and the year after thinking about what actually needs to be done in what sequence were there to be a government minded in this direction in 2029. Dilly Bradley asks, how do we best anticipate and forestall the inevitable obstructions from vested interests as we move to unscramble Blair's constitutional vandalism? And then I saw another question from Caroline Strafford. Good evening, Caroline. She asks about removing the quangos. This has been a common theme of the restoration that PopCon argues for, that we've got north of 400 of these quasi-autonomous non-governmental organisations. And I think that there may be one or two tiny exceptions like the Bank of England, but we should basically go through the lot of them. Yeah. And in some cases abolish a number of their functions or the body itself. Yeah. I'm not sure we need an advertising standards authority, for example. Secondly, if you're not going to abolish it, perhaps it could be privatized. Some of these things could move to self-regulation amongst the industry. But probably in the biggest category is actually, and I choke on these words a bit, renationalize, that you actually just put them wholly within the ambit of the relevant government department. The Environment Agency shouldn't be separate from the Department for the Environment, for God's sake. The Sentencing Guidance Council shouldn't be separate from the Justice Department, and so it goes on. So two questions there. I think the first one is, do you think tackling that administrative state, which isn't really the civil service as such, that's not Sir Humphrey Appleby, that's experts in one particular area who deign that because their expertise is in saving bats, we must have a colossally expensive bat tunnel over a piece of railway. But then the second thing is, where do you see them as the enemy, where do you think the enemy's front line or most vicious line of attack will be? Is it the civil service? Is it the House of Lords? Is it the media?
The Supreme Court.
Who is it?
I mean, the pinch point will come with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court already has a majority in it that basically believes that they have a greater moral authority to adjudicate on the basis of abstract rights. And there will come a crisis, and we need to prepare for it, and we need to prepare the ground for the battle. But there will come a crunch moment where the Supreme Court says that, notwithstanding what Parliament has said, ministers cannot do what has been authorised according to Parliament. Look, I came up with a plan in milestones to eliminate within the first 3 weeks of an incoming administration 8 of the 24 departments of state. Milei did something very similar in Buenos Aires. As part of that, you also need to look at the non-departmental public bodies that you referred to. That's the technical name of all these quangos. You need to remove a lot of the non-departmental public bodies by, as you suggest, wrapping them up into the remaining Whitehall departments. You need to do all of that. The first, if you don't do any of this, the first attack you will get from the civil servants will be the moment Farage walks in as Prime Minister, or whoever it is walks in as Prime Minister, where the civil servants basically try to tell him what he can and can't do. And they will present to him legal advice and tell him that he's legally, personally culpable if he goes against their advice. So to preempt that, eliminate those civil servants before you even walk in the door. Then hire the civil servants to take on the roles you want on the express understanding that they are there to do what you and Parliament have mandated them to do. The next line of attack will be from the judiciary, which is why you need emergency legislation to address the issue of judicial tenure, to sack from the bench a large number of judges appointed by the Judicial Appointments, Quango, and why you also need to rein in judicial review. If you don't do that, you're not going to get very far. You will end up doing what all administrations do, which is trying to address our problems with press releases and by recreating scenes from the thick of it rather than effective statecraft. So you need to line up all your ducks, control the civil service, rein in the judiciary, rein in the Quango state. But make no doubt about it, you will be on the receiving end of a very sustained campaign. The people that we're dealing with are like the Habsburgs or the Bourbons. They won't accept democracy as a superior moral mandate to what they believe is their entitlement to rule. And I think you need to recognize that they will have to go the way of the Bourbons and the Habsburgs. You need to be almost Leninist about it. You need to be prepared to destroy the institutions that get in your way. If the Foreign Office continues to ignore what they're supposed to do, which is the practice of statecraft in Britain's national interest, and instead lobby for gender equality and climate change, you need to be prepared to shut that institution down and P45 the people who work for it. If you're not willing to do that, in fact, if you don't do that to make an example of certain institutions, you're basically going to end up being, another Boris Johnson type government.
Yeah, so this, I think, moves us on, Douglas. Sorry, see, one or two people have said they can't hear me that clearly. It might be my microphone, but I'll at least try and move closer to the microphone, so I hope I can come across loud and clear. Is who is to do this, right? What is the vehicle to achieve it? How much should we worry about that? I mean, I'm very interested in getting the plan in place, and I think that can come from all sorts of directions. I was absolutely delighted when you intervened in the debate with, I think, such clarity of thought. And, I want think tanks, I think, to turn their attention to this really, rather than the retail end of politics about, exactly how beneficial would a 0.25% cut in corporation tax be. But on the party political level, there are a good number of questions here about what is the vehicle to achieve this. Joanna Reeves, good to see Joanna, says, can any UK party make the change Douglas recommends to turn the UK around? If so, which? If not, what is lacking? Dave Robertson asks, do you think that Mrs. Badenoch is the leader to bring about the restoration we so desperately need? Phil Dixon, slightly different question. Can the right-wing power in our electoral system, while it's divided, that's a bit of how we get there. Is there a danger of a red, orange, green traffic light coalition after the next election? So I suppose that puts on the table some grand alliance of Reform and the Conservatives, but both of them seem to be dead set against that. Angela Redley asked the interesting question, is what Douglas is suggesting what Liz Truss tried to do and failed? Do you think that will cast a shadow over any of these efforts that we tried that and we didn't get anywhere?
Can I
what's
deal with
your
that?
thought of the vehicle, the people, the personnel?
Let me deal with that last point first. No disrespect to Liz and Dominic, but I get slightly frustrated by hearing from people who once had their levers on power saying that if only they had done this. I don't think Liz did have a clear strategy for doing this. I think if she did have a clear strategy for doing it, she wouldn't have come unstuck so soon. I don't think Dominic, despite all that he's said since, had a clear plan for doing this. Offered the opportunity to do things like rewrite the Civil Service Management Code, offered the opportunity to create a department of the Prime Minister. He ended up, I think, removing the doors between the Cabinet Office and Downing Street. None of the big strategic things that needed to be done were planned for, implemented or executed, or even attempted to be implemented and executed on either of their watch. So none of this has been done. A lot of what has been said subsequently is post facto justification for what happened in office. Who can do this? It's all very well coming up with ideas. You need people to implement them. Clearly, it's a case of either Reform or the Conservatives. Let me share my doubts about either as it's currently configured. I'm just not convinced that Kemi Badenoch really gets it. I just, maybe this is irrational, but I just don't think someone who thinks that it's appropriate to major on restricting social media access to 16-year-olds is someone who's really willing to learn the lessons of 14 years of overbearing patrician Tory government. I just don't think she really deeply understands what it is that her lot got so wrong. What about Nigel and Reform? Look, I wish them well. I wish the Conservatives well, but I have my doubts. A lot of this stuff requires granular understanding of some rather boring detail. And I think without that granular understanding of rather boring detail, you can be in office but not in power. You will be so mesmerized by being the Prime Minister. You'll be so excited about the prospect of chairing cabinet meetings, you will lose sight of the granular detail of what you actually need to do, a la Bismarck, to reconfigure the state and apply realpolitik. So I don't know who's going to do this. My job really is to offer two things. It's to offer these ideas, and it's to offer a strategy. I've learned something in politics. It's not enough to write pamphlets and ideas. You need a strategy, a stepping stone type strategy, a milestones type strategy, a realpolitik type strategy that allows players to implement by guile the things that you want to implement. You need a theory of power. You need a way in which you can make these ideas a reality. And that requires pragmatism. It requires having ideas, but not being blindly ideological. It requires being prepared to take wins where you can get them and be patient and play the long game. It requires, I think, fundamentally for conservatives to do a reverse Gramsci. The left beautifully understood how to win by capturing institutions. We need to understand how that's been done, how it's been disastrous for people of a conservative persuasion, and we need to play a long game of reverse Gramsci. And when we get into power, we need to use all the levers at our disposal. Look at some of the things that have gone wrong with Britain in recent, the Bank of England deciding to get rid of Churchill. Who appointed half the people in the Bank of England over the past 20 years, do you think? Look at the fact that the British Museum wants to hand back the Elgin marbles. Who do you think appointed the people to run the British Museum? We complain about the BBC and the Electoral Commission. Who do you think appointed these people? We complain about the Chagos deal. Who do you think appointed the people who came up with the Chagos deal? We need to be much more better at practicing ruthless realpolitik statecraft. That, I think, is almost more important than whether it's Nigel or Kemi.
That's really interesting. I do want to come back to the party political question at some point. In fact, we're going to put up another survey asking people, irrespective of your own party allegiance at the moment, or if you have none, what do you actually expect the result of the next election to be? We've given you a range of options, slightly tilted to a range of different centre-right options. But the point about the patronage, Douglas, and sort of, when Labour get in, they appoint left-wing people. When the Conservatives get in, they feel guilty and also appoint left-wing people to all these various things. I wonder whether we've actually got a more fundamental problem than that. And I'll exaggerate for effect, but because I know Con Home, the Conservative Home website, so I said, here are some public appointments. Please encourage people of a Conservative mindset to apply. But if you're of a Conservative mindset, a good number of these jobs are of no interest. I don't want to be the head of the milk marketing board setting the price of milk in the East Midlands, whereas a socialist would want that job. You see what I mean? It's a bit like you will find, generally speaking, classical liberal demonstrations don't happen at the same scale or with the same number as hard left demonstrations, because the mindset is not such that people of our ilk want to go and make money.
Give an example. If you have a national quango that decides the national curriculum, it's only ever going to end up being of a leftist persuasion, because even if you get lots of right-wing people in charge of it, they will reinforce the idea that there should be a national curriculum, which is the antithesis of what conservatives should want.
So it seems to me that there still needs to be a kind of slimming of the state as well as a reconfiguration of it. I just don't think you can find enough conservative people to slot into all of these positions. So you need to radically reduce the positions, or crucially, make sure that all of these positions are directly responsible to the minister, who is then not tied up in legal red tape and told that he can't possibly do X or Y.
I mean, if you want to do a reverse Gramsci and make sure the left doesn't control the institutions, step number one is to shut down a lot of those institutions and dissolve them. You can't have a left controlling institutions if you don't have the institutions. The institutions that have to remain, you should then use the power of patronage. And one of the ideas I came up with in my milestones blueprint was one of the things that a department of the Prime Minister has to have is a unit that is dedicated full-time to appointing people to positions that share the priorities of the incoming administration. I think Michael Gove appointed a man called Juniper, who is a leftist environmentalist, to oversee one of these quangos. We must never again return to those sorts of mistakes. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the best way of a reverse Gramsci is to shut down a lot of these institutions entirely. Quite right.
And let me just press you a bit more on the party political point, because especially for people on this call, it will be agonizing them. And if anything, I see Jeremy Brown has made this point as well on the survey. We didn't list Restore Britain as a party that you might be a member of, or Advance UK, or the Heritage Party. There seems to be even more of a fracturing now, which does seem based around the question of possibly which individual, but what sort of approach is going to work best. So to roughly summarize those, Kemi and the Conservatives say, yeah, we did screw up over 14 years, but we've had a bit of time to reflect on it. And under new management, we won't make the same mistakes again. Farage says you can't possibly trust the Tories. They say one thing and they never keep their promises, and they don't really understand the scale of the issue, and is tapping into a lot of grievance. I don't say that in a critical fashion. There's a lot for people to have grievances about. And now you've got sort of Ben Habib and Rupert Lowe sort of saying, well, actually, Farage is just part of this sort of uni-party thing. He's not sufficiently serious about the sort of reset that the likes of Carswell wants. We're going to have a completely new vehicle. And it depends which opinion polls you believe. But, roughly at the moment, Reform seem to be somewhere in the mid to high 20s, the Conservatives in the high teens. Restore Britain appears in some opinion polls if prompted, but maybe at a few percentage points if not prompted. This has to be sorted out, right? Otherwise, all of these ideas fall on fallow ground.
I mean, I look at my Twitter feed, and it obviously exercises a lot of people. But this is, and I'm often asked who I would vote for if I voted in the next British general election. These are my thoughts. If I lived in Great Yarmouth, I would vote for Rupert. If I lived in Clacton, I would vote for Nigel. If I lived in Saffron Walden, I would vote for Kemi. Mm-hmm. Now, I think with the internet, most people are smart enough to be able to look up who's the most likely to win out of those three where they live and vote accordingly. At some point, and I think it's very likely that you will see a centre-right majority at the next election. There will be calls for them to do a deal before the election, and maybe they will, maybe they won't. I think at some point, the centre-right and the right in Britain need to come together, and I think that will happen. But look, there's so much animus between the three parties at the moment, and there's so much has been said that can't be unsaid. I'm not really going to get drawn into that. If you imagine a scenario where we had the general election yesterday, I think it's likely that you will see Reform will probably be the biggest of those three parties. I don't think it will win an absolute majority. I think it's simply too big a hurdle to jump. And I don't think Reform yet has the institutional memory as to how to win elections. So I think it will underperform relative to where it's polling. I think the Conservatives will overperform relative to where they're polling, particularly if they had a new leader. But I think the Conservatives and Reform together, perhaps with a smattering of MPs for like Rupert from Yarmouth, I think if they were to work together after an election, they would form a commanding majority. So I'm not too bothered about that. I think it's something that I can't influence. I would love them to all sit down and work it out. I just don't think that's going to happen before an election.
That's interesting. Well, just to give a snapshot of what people expect to happen, and we didn't include Rupert Lowe winning outright. We only have so many options we can give you. 4% expect a Conservative majority. 15% think there'll be a Conservative-led coalition or a Conservative minority. 26% think there will be a Reform majority government. 38% think that the government will be Reform-led, but will be a coalition.
That's where I am.
Minority. 16% think the left will remain in power, and only 1% has the modesty to say don't know. I think that probably would have been how I would have voted. But
I think I'm with the 36 or 38. I think that's the most likely scenario. I think if Robert Jenrick had stayed in the Conservative Party and replaced Kemi Badenoch, it would be a Conservative-led majority. I think the consequence of him leaving the party and Kemi remaining leader is that it'll be a Reform-led government after the next election.
So I guess then I want to finish up with what I mean, because we can't, you're quite right, we can't magic away or even actually pretend to understand all of the details about the interpersonal relationships. And I think these things can't be done just on a spreadsheet or on a chessboard. But what can be done to try and bring this together? And is it a question of persuading that we get out your milestones, or we put together some booklet and sort of say, could we persuade everybody on the right of centre to basically agree these principles, or so you try and make the Venn diagram as much of a circle as possible.
That's what I'm trying to do.
Platform. Right.
That's what I'm trying to do. I think looking at this from 4,000 miles away gives me a perspective. I don't have a dog in the fight. I think one of the few things I can do to help around the margins is to say, this is a blueprint for a centre-right government that wants to repudiate. Do you believe that the last 30 years has been a series of disastrous and disappointing administrations? I mean, if you're in the business of defending what governments have done over the past 30 years, I'm not on your side. Mm-hmm. If, like me, you want a clean break from the Blairite administrations of the past 30 years, and you want to fix the country from some of the disastrous consequences of that Blairite mindset, what do we need to do to create a blueprint for modern British statecraft? Looking at, for example, Singapore, a country that was incredibly effective at getting things done, had an incredibly effective system of governance. How can we learn from countries like that? If you want to do that, here's a blueprint. And I think if they can each come to agree on the basics of the blueprint, they can then squabble over each other as to who should be the foreign secretary, who should be the chancellor of the exchequer, and who should stand next to Kemi or Nigel as they sign the orders in council. That I can't influence that, and frankly, when I was a member of parliament, I had no ability to influence any of that. What I think we can do is devise a blueprint, devise a strategy based on realpolitik, and I hope that they will then come together around that plan, those proposals. I mean, the other alternative is for some of the tremendously wealthy donors who are currently funding both sides of the split to bang heads together. But having been in this situation back in the days of UKIP, I know that actually it's incredibly difficult to get people to come together before an election, even though every mathematical, logical possibility, electoral logical possibility tells you to do some kind of non-aggression deal. It's remarkably difficult to get some of these boneheaded people to see sense.
John Strafford asked, I think you've sort of answered this, Douglas, if you were in the UK today, which political party would you join and which would you vote for? Would you join any if you were back in Britain? I mean, you said you'd vote tactically according to the positions on the ground, giving a particular reference to Lowe, Farage and Badenoch.
Yeah, I wouldn't join any political party, not because I don't admire people who are in political parties. It's just I sort of slightly feel that I've been there as a member of the Conservative Party since I was a teenager till I left. I was then a member of UKIP. I kind of feel I've done that. As I said, if I lived in Clacton, I would cheerfully vote for Nigel. If I lived in Great Yarmouth, I would cheerfully vote for Rupert. If I lived in Saffron Walden, I would cheerfully vote for Kemi. And I would campaign for any of them if they asked me to. I want them all to do well. But, I think fundamentally, the country is heading in a catastrophic direction. And the only way that the centre-right can get its act together and unite is if it agrees on what it is that needs to be done. And I don't think we're there yet. There are still too many in reform who are good at pointing out the problems. We know the problems. We know about mass immigration. We know about runaway universal benefits and all the rest of it. What is it that a reform government would do? We've still got too many in the Conservative Party who, because they happen to be the minister for widgets when these disastrous decisions were being made, feel that they need to go out there and defend idiotic Blairite regime policy when they should actually be wanting to repudiate it. So, I think if we can get reform and the Conservatives to abandon some of their worst tendencies and to agree on what it is we need to do to restore the country, the restoration revolution, I think David Starkey calls it, If we can get them to focus on that, then I think they will naturally come together.
That's really, really interesting. I mean, I share I remain a member of the Conservative Party at present, but I share that frustration. It seems to me that Reform, by and large, are correctly shouting that the patient has cancer,
Yep.
but haven't yet worked out what the chemotherapy might look like or the surgery
Yep.
might look like in any detail, but are saying, look, the patient is really ill. The Conservatives are saying, well, the patient's unwell, here's a Lemsip. And somehow
Correct.
or other, we need to get them back. And
It's a very, very good way of putting it.
the question I just want to leave you with then, Douglas, is that's interesting in the political sphere. Do you think the electorate are anywhere close to this, or will they just think we're mad, that we're sort of arguing about getting rid of the Judicial Appointments Committee and, you know, re-empowering the Lord Chancellor and making sure that the buckles on his shoe are perfectly polished, and some obscure argument about, you know, who appoints permanent secretaries and whether they're political appointments or not, and, you know, some almighty clash between Parliament and the judges? Do you think the British electorate will think, what the hell is going on here? All I want is on the retail end for, you know, my taxes to go down, for me to be able to get an NHS appointment, for the, you know, the quality of my kids' school to be better, for petrol to cost less. But the electorate are still in the kind of retail end of it, rather than thinking what I want now is a big fight about the Constitution.
One of the great failings of the Blairites over the past 30 years has been this assumption that the voters are stupid and that they must be spoken to in retail-friendly sound bites. Mm-hmm. And that if you talk to them in retail-friendly sound bites, you will persuade them. If you go into the gory detail, you will lose them. This is one of the reasons why I think people are so disillusioned with politics, because they can sense that they're being talked down to. I happened to be on YouTube the other day watching some old videos of Margaret Thatcher being interviewed. And what was so striking about Thatcher is, before the days of triangulation, before the days of Clinton and Blair sound bites, Thatcher was asked questions and would go into extraordinary detail. I don't believe that most of the people listening to her were familiar with every single thing she was saying, but the overall impression was that she knew what she stood for, she had a plan, and she was not talking down to the people listening to her. I think if you want to fix the country and you're asked how to fix the country, you need to elaborate some of the detail about what's gone wrong in government. You need to elaborate on some of the detail about what's gone wrong with the judiciary. Because although people may not understand the minutiae of the judicial review system, although they may not understand the minutiae of the Judicial Appointments Commission, they can feel in their bones that there is something rotten with the state of Britain, and that it requires someone with a plan. One of the things that focus groups tend to suggest, and although I may be 4,000 miles away, I keep a very close eye on these things through friends. One of the reservations that undecided voters have about Nigel at the moment is a sense, not so much that he hasn't got a team around him, but that he doesn't have a plan. They agree with him, but there's a question mark that he would be effective. So I think actually it's all the more imperative that when you talk about how you're going to deport people, you don't just say you'll appoint a minister for deportations, what the Blairites might do. You don't just say you're going to leave the ECHR, which is what the Tories might do. You actually explain to voters how you're going to make sure that judges cannot keep thwarting you. Now, if you do that, then you have credibility. Mm-hmm. And it's credibility that the right needs to close this deal in the minds of the electorate between now and the next election. So don't shy away from detail. I never lost an election. I ran for office in Clacton under different parties of different colours. I never lost an election, and I never shied away of going into detail when I was asked a question by voters. They may not understand the minutiae of it, but they know that the person they're talking to understands or doesn't understand based on the detail that you're willing to give them. Credibility is the thing that is most lacking in politics at the moment. So don't hold back on giving voters detailed answers to detailed questions. They've had 30 years of being bullshitted to. Give them the detail.
I think that's a fascinating piece of advice, and I suspect it's not just, if you like, morally appropriate, but cephalogically accurate as well.
One of the great arguments, if I may say, Mark, against going into detail is that you would get a gotcha moment from a BBC journalist and you would go into too much detail and they would throw the superfluous, twisted information back at you. No one cares what BBC journalists and news programs think anymore. No one cares about Cathy Newman and Robert Peston anymore. So go into the detail and don't be afraid of the gotcha moments.
Yeah. My sort of sense is as well, I mean, huge anecdote alert, but when I do go out canvassing, and actually, David Starkey and I on one side of the panel had this argument a good number of months ago against Johnny Mercer and Gavin Barwell on the other side of the panel, who sort of said, look, it's all about...
Was Johnny Mercer in the army? I think he was in the armed forces, I heard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And their argument was basically it's all about the retail proposition. You know, people want their taxes to go down. They want their public services to work. You've got to keep focusing on that. And, you know, he sort of said, you know, when was the last time, you know, Mark, you ever knocked on a door and heard somebody saying we've got to change the rules about judicial review or such like? Or, you know, I'm a bit worried that the civil service code, you know, needs to be rewritten. When was that? Well, presumably they were actually just complaining about their taxes or they can't get a hospital appointment. And my riposte to that is, whilst that's true, if you sort of ask a voter, you know, what are the problems on your mind at the moment, it's likely to be something that touches their day-to-day lives. I've also picked up, and it's been volunteered to me, that a large number of voters saying Britain is broken, nothing works anymore, the whole system is screwed. Yeah. I'm almost unsurprised I can't get a doctor's appointment, or it's taking 2 years to hear from the planning department, or God only knows what else. I'm unsurprised because the whole system's broken. Now, they might not have drilled into exactly how the Equalities Act or the Human Rights Act affects that, but I think in some ways they're several steps ahead of the political class in terms of needing a reboot of our rules. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, a key tenet of realpolitik is to understand that zeitgeist, sorry to sound so German, the spirit of the age is absolutely critical in politics. And the spirit of the age, the ordinary voters in Britain understand the essential dysfunctional nature of the British state. You don't need to go into detail about it. They get it. They know it. You do need to go into some detail as to how you're going to fix it, because although they may not understand the granular detail, they want to know that you know what it is you're going to do, because they've heard people telling them what they think they want to hear for as long as they can remember. When I go and see my doctor and my doctor starts explaining what he's going to do to improve my health, and I don't quite understand all the medical terms, I don't stop trusting him. In fact, I trust him all the more because I know that he knows what he's doing. Don't make the mistake of thinking that the British people want you to fix their problems by talking down to them. They won't think you're just talking down to them. They'll think you're as clueless as the last lot.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting. Just on the last question, in terms of the divisions on the right, we were obviously set up within the Conservative Party initially, but are ecumenical. We did ask the audience, which party are you a member of? The results there are Conservative 52%, Reform 24%, Conservative and Reform 4%. Entirely up, that's between you and the party rulebook. Restore, Rupert Lowe's party, 3%, other 1%. I guess that could be Advance UK, and not a member of any political party, 16%. Just to wrap up, Douglas, how optimistic are you? Do you think this is all probably going to come together? There'll be missteps on the way, and there'll be personality clashes, and, you know, people will fall out with each other, and there will be... And, you know, you and I might not get 100% of what we want. I mean, if you look back at the Thatcher era, you know, she actually hit pause on a number of reforms that she might have undertaken in order to really focus and zoom in on the reforms that she felt were high priority. How optimistic are you that if we were having this discussion in 4 years' time, we'll be in the first year of a British government that is actually doing its best in some half-competent way to actually get this sort of reset done?
Britain might be broken, but Britain's not doomed. Britain will recover. Britain will get better. The country is going to, I think, go through a very traumatic period, and I think things will get worse before they get better. Indeed, every week that the current clown show in Downing Street stays in office, the country will get worse. I think the lights probably literally will go out. I think there will be serious economic problems. Part of me actually wishes that the bond market would stop lending to the British government at current rates, because the sooner the markets call time, the greater the chances of an early election. And the thought of these clowns being in office for another 3 years terrifies me.
Mhm.
But the country will recover. We have been in this situation. Imagine what it must have been like for our forebearers to have been in 1940 or 1916, or even 1979 was pretty grim. We know all of the time now that we know those instances ended well, but we've had our back to the wall before. These problems can be fixed, but in order to fix them, things need to change. In order for the country that we love to stay the same, things are going to have to change dramatically.
Mhm.
They can be fixed, but it's going to require a very different type of government, a very different way of governing the country. It's going to require people who are prepared to be radical, to be bold. It's going to require us to change some of what we believe are settled assumptions about multiculturalism and mass immigration. It's going to require us to be willing to do things when it comes to government spending and taxation that we've not done before. But these problems can be fixed. I'm absolutely certain they can be fixed, but it's going to take time. In milestones, to give you an idea, I assume that if you got a new administration in office, it would take you a full 5-year term to get public spending down to what it had been before COVID, another parliamentary term, full term, to get back to where it was at the end of the Blairite administration. In other words, it would take a full decade of good governance, good centre-right administration to get you back to where you need to be before you can even begin to move back to a sort of South Korean type level of tax and spend. So it's going to be a long march. But the older I get, and as I watch my daughter grow up, the more I think it's worth it. It's really worth it. We've had 30 years of catastrophic administration. I was lamenting with a friend the other day about the shoddy state of the British armed forces and the Royal Navy. It will take 10, 15, 20 years for us to get back to being able to field the 4 divisions that we need and the Royal Navy that we need, and to be the country that we once were. It can be done, but it's going to be a long march.
Douglas, been wonderful to hear from you. Thank you so much, my friend, for joining
Wonderful.
us. Such brilliant insight, and thank you for your wisdom from across the pond. I promise one day I will fulfill my continual pledge to come over and meet you in the great state of Mississippi.
We would love to host you. Come and do one of your broadcasts, your PopCons from the Deep South.
Yeah, I would love to do that. And it looks like we have much to learn from not just you, but the state of Mississippi as well. So thanks so much for your insight and thinking on this. It really is appreciated by all of us on this side of the pond. Just let folk know, if you haven't opened the chat box, our next Pop Conversation will be next Monday, the 23rd of March at 7 p.m. We'll be joined by former Conservative MP Steve Baker. There's a link in the chat box there if you haven't already signed up for that. Also, save the date. You can't yet sign up for it, but we have Jacob Rees-Mogg joining us on Thursday, the 9th of April. And looking further down the line, we've got top pollster and strategist James Frayne on Monday, May the 11th, to help us make sense of the local Scottish and Welsh elections. More details on both of those will be in our weekly newsletter, which I hope you will all receive. If not, go to popularconservatism.com and sign up to that. My thanks again to Douglas. Absolutely fascinating conversation. That's why I let it run on 15 minutes over our normal allotted time. I hope you've enjoyed it. I got through as many of your questions as I could. Join us next time with Steve Baker. Keep in touch, keep the faith, keep the flag of freedom flying. Have a great night. Over and out.